Nancy, you're up.
Okay, thank you. I am going to share my screen. Thank you, Victoria, for breaking the ice on slides. Okay, here we go. I tend to think in terms of infographics, and that's what I'll be talking about today. So thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Um, I work on a lot of this stuff, have worked on it for a long time. And so when we start, like, what is it that I do? This is an easier way to talk about it because so many people are unfamiliar with digital preservation or believe that they're familiar and they're not. So I am an archivist and a data curator who is responsible for digital preservation in a library. And when we come back to the final thing about what should we think about for graduate programs, and that's significant because professional identity is still important, but it's changed. And what do we need to know about that? The diagram you see there basically gets at the kind of footprint of the holistic part of what I have to do, which goes from humans to technology and back, trying to sort of implement things that will demonstrate good practice. So I'm responsible for building the digital preservation at MIT program at MIT, and it's taken longer than you might think. But most universities don't focus on. They focus on the kinds of technologies that we've just heard about. They don't focus on some of the everyday technologies that we do in archives and preservation. So it just gets to show you at the bubbles are the active work that content comes in, we process it. The squares are the storage spaces that we need, and we have different rules for it. We just got it, we're processing it, we're preserving it, and moving through the life cycle. Underneath that is the technologies that we need to do things across generations of technology. So these are the kind of things I work on, both for the community and for building the program at MIT. The thing about the connection between the people who are responsible for often current technologies and what I need to do, which is trying to bring them across time, is that radical collaboration is really, really necessary. And we think we do collaboration all the time, and we actually coordinate, or we tell people what we did after. That's I shared a link with for the list of resources for today to this issue we did on radical collaboration, because it's really important to come to the table with questions, not advocacy, to sort of come and say we are all tasked with doing this particular problem solving mission, and what do we bring to it. So this roundtable of digital practice just gets at some of the strengths that different domains bring to the problems that we're addressing, and how we might all work together. And that there's no obvious lead. Just because there's a dominant, like there's more of this domain at the table, doesn't mean that they're necessarily responsible for the whole of the project and the implementation. So it's sort of the social contract, and from my perspective. On the other side of the diagram is this technology assessment, because what I've been trying to work towards is collaborative technology assessments partnered with IT, not a tennis match, but more how do we get into this together? You have the deep technological knowledge. I have technical skills and an understanding of what we're trying to do. So how do we partner on that and figure out what do we have and how do we transform it into what we need? In each of the cases where you see the general technology context and this particular category, and the context refers to the ways in which applications of AI might be useful for digital preservation. And we're just really in the early days of thinking about that for digital preservation in particular. And I wanted to put this one up because it similarly brings together the pieces of the puzzle, but from the where humans and technologies meet and the kind of different roles and responsibilities. And I'm responsible for overtime kinds of things. I started in the mid 80s and working on preserving digital content, and that was in the digital archives column, where we're thinking about how do we do these things. And it wasn't first generation stuff, but it was next generation stuff. And there was a lot to figure out. The overtime digital preservation stuff has formally been developing since the 90s, and people conflate them. So I've recently been working on disambiguating them, so we can have kind of conversations like we're having today. One of the things that occurs to me when I hear all the amazing examples we just heard is, how would we preserve those things? What would we preserve about them? What how do we understand the significance and convey that to the future, which may look very different than preserving the content itself. So it shows the partnerships with the IT stack. It shows, like, I'm responsible for figuring out how to preserve things. I used to be responsible for what to preserve, but these are all partnerships and the connections between people. So I mentioned that is that how has your work changed? Funnily enough, when you really get to deeply know a generation of technology, as I did more than once from the 80s into the early 2000s, it gives you a sense of perspective because we are looking at decades for digital preservation of generations of technology. And, sort of like the more things change, the more they stay the same. There are always tools to do the functions that we need. In fact, some of them simply change operating systems. And that was a real surprise to me when I started seeing that happen. What I think we're seeing now, and we've all experienced the impact of the pandemic on what we do and how we do it. And I think it's going to be comparable to the impact that World War II had on technology. And I think we need to give ourselves the opportunity of a fresh page to step back and not assume anything about this point forward because it's been so dramatic. There have been, it was not possible to do Zooms like this not that long ago, not because it wasn't possible, but because organizationally, that's just not how we were doing it. So when you think about that, all of the PhDs that are going to come out of the pandemic and its impact in all the areas we're talking about today, and you think about how long it takes technology to change, it can change fast or it can change slow. The paperless office was first announced in 1976, and we're far from there. So that fits into this whole discussion of AI. For instance, right now, the MIT Libraries is committed to computational, and we're discovering what that means. It will mean something very different for digital preservation. Most people are thinking about the access front end, and most of the AI applications for my area for digital practice are in access or in digital archives. Some of the tools, how do we understand the information? But I wanted to share with you today an example that does get at the implications for digital preservation in connection with AI. First, one of the things that's changed, certainly we have new tools and we have new technologies, but some of it really does just morph into the next iteration of those things. We're finally getting a recognition that the people side of technology can be often harder than the technology part of it, and a real understanding that digital preservation is not a technology only problem. And that's a huge relief for me because that's conversations that we were having for just a long time. So this is the example. So how has AI affected your field of scholarship or practice? Not enough yet, but there is all this untapped potential. And for instance, right before the world went sideways, about January 2020, I was invited to participate in an AI in Archives panel at the Sundance Festival. And as soon as I could tell people, they were like, Sundance? Yes, the Sundance. They were talking about many of the examples, especially your examples, Victoria, about the documentary telling stories, how do we do things? And it was fascinating. But what I learned from the deep dive I had to do is that we don't talk about AI in the same ways. It can mean lots of different things, and it would be very useful to spend time getting a common understanding of what we mean by it. So I learned that part. I also learned that even though people came to the panel, what they really wanted to talk about was how to preserve their stuff. So we're still kind of not ready for some of the things that we want to do and anticipate. Some of the things I think that we could be interested in for digital collections is, how does AI work with different kinds of content, whether it's born digital or digitized, and how do we understand some of those dynamics? And similarly, when it comes, so for archives, it might be that equitable access means using AI on finding aids rather than on the content itself. And that's a sort of different perspective than some other fields that share the space around digital practice. So this is work it's from my PhD. And at that time, we were talking about data mining. and kind of pushing the limits of that. But this is what I was trying to get at is how do we systematically evaluate so we can respond to the technologies that are emerging, the technological change, which happens in big lumps and in small lumps. So just looking at those are OAS, the Open Archival Information System Reference Model, is the core digital preservation standard, and that's all I'm going to say about it today. People are familiar with it or not, but basically it's our standard for the life cycle, how we manage it across time. This is just a list of when I did my analysis of that model, what are the technologies you need to implement something that is conformant with OAS? These are all the ones that show up, and you can see some of the ones we're talking about today that were implied but not specified in the standard. Artificial intelligence is one, natural language processing, but there are a whole bunch of them. So how would we monitor all of these things to sort of see what's going to impact how can this help or hinder what we're going to do with the technologies that are emerging? How do we keep track of them? Um, the bottom part of the screen looks at the functional areas of OAS. So you ingest, you bring stuff in, you store it for the long term, you know about it, you manage it over time, you plan for the future, which is preservation planning, and you make it available. But these are the starting point for how we might identify information that we might want to use to manage our stuff over time. But we need to be able to prioritize it. So a big part of what I was focused on is assigning priorities to the information based on the significance of the technologies for digital preservation. And just as an example, audit submission has a score of 50, and that means it's the most it can have. And there's a direct relationship with some technologies and what we do for digital preservation. There's an enabling relationship. It helps, but it's not immediately in contact. And then there's an indirect. And so if we know that there's lots of technologies, how would we prioritize them? These are just examples of how that would happen. And the kind of scoring was based on interaction with the content, opportunity, like how potential is the technology, the risk management involved, and automation, things like that. This got at, in doing this, I had to think about, well, what do we already know about technology response? And it turns out in the 60s with space, technologies, really confusing and scaring people on some level. A lot of the technologies emerged then. Technology watch, technology forecasting and assessment, and technology transfer. From my perspective, all of these can contribute to competency building, which is what we need to incorporate technologies into what we do. It also is just a way of different ways of understanding and detecting emerging and changing technologies, which is really important. A thing about it is when these things were initially emerging, it was not possible. They bumped into their their wall of how they were going to be able to do this. And they couldn't, there was not enough processing. They weren't able to do it in the ways they want, but they were imagining what it would look like. This is sort of like about, well, then how would we time the assessments? It's in relation to when it's innovation, you want to be monitoring it. When it's invention, you want to be monitoring it so you know it's occurring. Innovation is when you have to start assessing before it goes into diffusion so that you can try to be informed about it and helpfully frame how that's going to work. So the technology responses would be at different points in this life cycle. How do you time your response? How do you time when you do an assessment? And this is the thing about this is what the model looks like. So there's lots of ongoing monitoring, and all of a sudden someone would ping up and say, now we need to really do this assessment. So everybody should be doing monitoring. Some set of experts at that point, like the round table that we looked at, should assess those technologies and then figure out how to respond to them. And that's what this work was all about, technology responsiveness. But I'm excited about the potential for AI and what we could do with it now and it will become like 10 years, 20 years, it would be more and more possible, but how might we go about those things? This is the knowledge model. So what kinds of things would you know when you're monitoring? What kinds of things would you need when you're analyzing for assessment? And what kinds of things would you end up with? Because we need to be able to share the results. We can't waste all our resources. It's very intensive to do an evaluation. So how would we share out? How would that work? So this just lines up the way that technologies emerge with the kinds of things we would be doing and the kind of things that a community might see in response to that. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen because that's enough of my slides. But to talk a little bit about the suggestions and ideas for the future generations and things, I do a lot of coaching for early and mid-career people, and I love doing that. And along the way, I've become sort of an academic practitioner, someone who engages in research-based practice, practice-based research. I'm a continuing educator that engages with lifelong learning and coaching. And the people who are coming to me are very often women trying to figure out how to navigate their career. And it's people who don't necessarily they want a researcher position because that's what mine is, and they're wondering about how to do that. So I think it's important to figure out how to help people with those things. The collaboration across domains, real collaboration, and really giving people an understanding of what it is and how to do it, and thinking about how to embrace equity, equality as pervasive throughout things, professional identity, how do we think about inclusion, the technical inclusion that we need to think about, that most of the organizations doing digital preservation are still very predictable, and we need to expand it around the globe and make sure that we're preparing people. How could people in academic programs and the students figure out how to help with that? And the final thing that I would mention is just there's a wonderful documentary called Coded Bias that if you haven't seen it, it was an amazing young researcher at MIT kind of spearheaded this, and it's a wonderful documentary about how discrimination and bias is coded into facial recognition. So it's worth a look. And that's it for me today.
Thanks so much, Nancy.